There are names that don't just belong to history, they linger. Names that feel less like people and more like warnings. Charles Manson is one of those names. Not because of what he physically did with his own hands, but because of what he convinced others to do for him. This is not a story about madness alone. This is a story about influence, vulnerability, control, and how easily darkness can disguise itself as belonging. And once you hear it, you won't be able to unsee it. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to disturbing true crime stories, psychological manipulation, and real cases that still echo through American history, subscribe to Open Case Files. New episodes dive deep into crimes that most people only know the surface of, and what comes next only gets darker. Charles Mills Manson was born in 1934, not into chaos, but into abandonment. His mother was a teenage girl drifting between trouble and survival, in and out of jail, incapable or unwilling to care for a child. From the beginning, Manson learned a brutal lesson. Affection was conditional, unstable, and something to be taken, not given. By the time he was a child, institutions became his home: reform schools, detention centers, places designed to fix broken boys, but that instead taught him how power worked among the lost and the forgotten. Manson grew up watching how fear controlled people, how charisma could replace strength, and how words could wound deeper than fists. He learned to read people quickly, their insecurities, their hunger for approval, their need to belong. While other boys learned trades or discipline, Manson learned manipulation. He learned how to mirror personalities, how to tell someone exactly what they wanted to hear, and how to make himself the center of their emotional gravity. By his early adulthood, crime was not an accident in his life, it was a pattern. Petty theft turned into fraud. Fraud turned into prison sentences. And prison, strangely, became the place where Manson refined himself. Behind bars, he studied philosophy, religion, music, and psychology. He absorbed ideas without boundaries, blending Eastern spirituality, Christian symbolism, pop culture, and racial paranoia into something uniquely his own. He wasn't building beliefs, he was building a system where he stood at the center. When Manson was released in the late 1960s, America itself was unraveling. The counterculture movement was in full bloom. Young people were rejecting authority, experimenting with drugs, searching for meaning, and desperately looking for leaders who promised truth outside the system. It was the perfect environment for someone like Manson. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a prophet. Barefoot, long-haired, speaking of love, freedom, and enlightenment. To the lost, he didn't seem dangerous. He seemed like an answer. He began gathering followers slowly, mostly young women who felt invisible, unwanted, or disconnected from their families. Manson didn't command them at first. He listened. He validated their pain. He reframed their trauma as proof that society had failed them, and that only he truly understood. Over time, admiration turned into dependence. Dependence turned into obedience, and obedience became absolute. The group that formed around him would later be known as the Manson Family, though it functioned less like a family and more like a psychological prison. They lived communally, shared possessions, shared identities, and eventually shared thoughts. Individuality was stripped away. Manson dictated what they ate, what they believed, who they slept with, and how they perceived reality itself. He positioned himself as both savior and judge, the only source of truth. Drugs played a crucial role, not as recreation, but as control. LSD and other hallucinogens were used deliberately to blur reality, weaken boundaries, and deepen suggestibility. During intense group sessions, Manson would speak for hours, reinforcing his worldview while his followers were psychologically exposed. Over time, they stopped questioning him. His words became their inner voice. At the same time, Manson was obsessed with fame. He believed he was destined to be a musical icon. He saw himself not just as a spiritual leader, but as a star waiting to be discovered. He pursued connections in Hollywood, drifting through Los Angeles, inserting himself in the music scene, convinced the world simply hadn't recognized his genius yet. Each rejection deepened his resentment and warped his vision further. Beneath the talk of peace and love, Manson nurtured a growing obsession with violence and apocalypse. He began preaching an impending racial war he called Helter Skelter, borrowing the name from a Beatles song and twisting its meaning into prophecy. According to Manson, society was on the brink of collapse, and his followers would survive by hiding, only to emerge later as rulers of a broken world. To them, it sounded insane. To his followers, it sounded inevitable. What made Manson truly dangerous wasn't strength, intelligence, or even madness. It was his ability to convince ordinary people that morality was flexible, that killing could be justified, even necessary, if framed as destiny. He spoke in riddles, contradictions, and symbolic language, making himself impossible to fully understand, yet impossible to question. The confusion wasn't a flaw, it was the point. As tensions grew within the group, paranoia intensified. Outsiders were enemies, society was corrupt, authority was evil. Manson reinforced the idea that loyalty to him was the only path to survival. Slowly, the line between fantasy and reality dissolved. His followers no longer asked if they should act, only when. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because what started as manipulation, ideology, and control was about to transform into something irreversible. The next phase of Charles Manson's life would no longer exist in the shadows of influence alone. It would explode into violence, shocking the nation, redefining evil, and etching his name into history forever. But that moment comes next. The summer of 1969 was supposed to represent the peak of the American dream. Music festivals preached peace. Hollywood celebrated excess and freedom. The counterculture promised a new world built on love and liberation. But beneath that illusion, something rotten was growing, and Charles Manson was ready to unleash it. Inside the family, Manson's grip had reached a critical point. His followers no longer saw themselves as individuals. They were extensions of his will. Their identities had been erased, replaced by a singular purpose: to serve him. What had once felt like freedom now functioned as total submission. And when Manson spoke of violence, it was no longer metaphor, it was instruction. Manson believed Helter Skelter had begun, or at least that it needed a push. In his distorted worldview, murders would be the spark that ignited racial chaos, forcing society into collapse. He didn't see himself as a killer, he saw himself as a catalyst, someone who understood the hidden order of things, and if blood was required, then blood was justified. On the night of August 8, 1969, Manson didn't personally wield a weapon. He didn't need to. He sent others to do it for him. That was his true power. He selected his followers carefully, reinforcing obedience one last time, and gave them a simple command: go out and do something witchy, something that would send a message, something that would shock the world. The house on Silo Drive was chosen not for the occupants, but for its symbolism. Manson believed it represented rejection, the Hollywood world that had denied him success. What happened inside that home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The brutality of the murders stunned the nation, not just because of what was done, but because of how senseless it appeared. No robbery, no clear motive, just chaos, cruelty, and ritualistic messaging left behind. The next night, Manson escalated. This time, he went with his followers, not to commit the murders himself, but to oversee them, to guide the process, to ensure the fear was absolute. The victims were different, the method was different, but the message was the same. Order was breaking down, and something monstrous was emerging in its place. When the news broke, America froze. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They felt deliberate, symbolic, almost theatrical. The media struggled to explain them. The police had no immediate suspects, and for weeks, the idea that a group of young people, guided by a single man's ideology, could commit such acts seemed impossible to process. But slowly, the cracks began to form. Members of the family were arrested for unrelated crimes. Loose tongues followed. Stories emerged. Strange, fragmented accounts of desert camps, drug-fueled sermons, and a man who spoke as if he were both God and devil. As investigators connected the dots, one name kept resurfacing: Charles Manson.